So Section 7 deals with monopolies. A monopoly is just a single producer within a market that makes all of the output. So you have this one firm making everything within that market. This section deals more in tune and more in detail with the prices that the monopolist is going to charge, how the monopolist keeps potential competitors at bay or keeps them away pretty much, and then whether or not consumers are better or worse off when we have a monopoly in the market. We're not talking about market power. That's just going to mean the ability for them to change or alter the price of whatever they're selling. Market demand, remember, is the total quantities of that good that people are willing and able to buy at whatever price within that given time period. The biggest thing that you should remember here is that it's downward sloping. So if we have something like this, where you're looking at quantity demanded and price, market supply is downward sloping like that. A monopoly is equal to the industry because it is the only thing producing within that industry. A lot of times a patent provides the ability for a monopoly to exist because it has the exclusive right in order to produce a product. Get a license, no one else can produce that thing, only you can. So remember that this monopoly is a single firm and it's producing the entire market supply of the good. And since a monopoly is equal to the industry, the monopoly's demand curve is also downward sloping. Now, this is important to remember because it's very different than the individual firm in a competitive market who had a flat demand curve. This monopoly has a downward sloping demand curve. Now, the marginal revenue for a monopoly is different than price. And remember that marginal revenue, anytime we have the term marginal, it's just another word for change. And revenue here is the amount of money they get from selling output. So it's the change in the money they receive from selling an output. So here, it's just the contribution to total revenue, so that change in total revenue from an additional unit of output. And we'll see that monopolists can only sell additional output if it reduces the price, because it has this downward sloping demand curve. People are only willing and able to purchase more goods that they produce if they reduce the price, right? There's this inverse relationship here. If they want quantity demanded to increase, they have to decrease price. So here we have our demand and our marginal revenue. And notice that always demand is higher than marginal revenue except for the very first unit. So here we have our total revenue, remember, which is just equal to price times quantity. So here we have price, here we have quantity, multiply them, it gives us this total revenue. And over here is our marginal revenue, which is just our change in total revenue over that change in quantity. And here we're just increasing by 1, so it's just our change in total revenue. So 24 minus 13 gives us 11, right? 33 minus 24 gives us 9. And notice here that except for the first, here now price is higher than the marginal revenue. 7's bigger than 1, 8's bigger than 3, 9's bigger than 5, 10's bigger than 7, 11's bigger than 9, and 12 is bigger than 11. And that is because they have a downward sloping demand curve. A monopolist is just like any other business in the sense that it wants to maximize its total profit. So whenever the monopolist wants to maximize his profit, it just goes to the point where marginal revenue equals marginal cost. And this is where it finds the production decision at this magical rule. So here in our graph, you can see the demand curve. If it'll let me draw it for you guys. We have our demand curve, marginal revenue curve below that. And then we see our marginal cost curve and the average total cost curve. So notice here at this point D, little d, this is where marginal revenue equals marginal cost. So the difference with the monopolist is we come down, if I can draw it right. So this would be our optimal output. So our profit maximizing output would be 4. To find the price we're going to charge, we then come up until we hit the demand curve, because the demand curve tells us the amount that people are willing and able to purchase at each specific price. And so this is our specific price that they're willing and able to purchase 4 units. So that profit maximizing price be $10. If we take average total cost, multiply it times quantity, that gives us total cost. So here is the point. We're at 4 units. This gives us our level of average total cost. So ATC is equal to 8. We know that our quantity is equal to 4. So here we know that our total cost is this little box right here. That will equal 32. To get total revenue, we take price times quantity. So here we know price is equal to 10. We know we have a quantity of 4. So we know our total revenue is going to be 40. And that is this entire box here. Now, to get total profit, it's just equal to total revenue minus total cost. So total revenue is 40, total cost is 32. Here our total profit would be 8, which here this distance, right, is 2. This distance is 4. 2 times 4 gives us the value of this box right here. I'm doodling in red, which is 8. Right? 2 times 4 equals 8. So it tells us this red box here, this tells us our total profit for the monopoly. So it's very important that once you get that intersection between marginal revenue and marginal cost, so you find where marginal revenue equals marginal cost, we get the profit maximizing output there. We get this special Q. But then we have to go up to the demand curve to tell us that price that consumers are willing and able to pay. And only that one price that we go up to the demand curve and go over for is compatible with the profit maximizing rate of output, because that gives us our profit maximizing price. Now, there are barriers to entry. So that means that the monopoly does something that prevents any competition from entering the market, so that monopoly stays a single producer. And the idea here is that for a monopoly, we would choose this point here because we have marginal revenue, marginal cost, and at this point, our marginal cost equals marginal revenue. So then we come down, profit maximizing output for the monopoly is 4, come up, to the demand curve and then go over. So for the monopoly, price will be 10, and for the monopoly, quantity will be 4. But if we were to look at the market for a perfectly competitive market, demand is equal to marginal revenue when it's perfectly competitive. So here, at this point, remember we find where marginal cost equals price, because price equals marginal revenue for our perfectly competitive market. And then we would come over and find that price for a competitive market would only be 9. So you have a lower price, and here 5 units would be sold. So in a competitive market, more units would be sold at a lower price. So we can see that a monopoly actually makes it worse off for consumers because they have to pay a higher price and less is being sold. So remember that these barriers to entry restrict the quantity of goods being supplied because it does not allow more people to come in and start supplying it. Some of the entry barriers could be legal harassment. So if they just sue new entrants, if it's a really large business, they could possibly have a lot of money set aside. So if they start suing a new small business coming up, they could make that business go bankrupt just from all the legal fees. They could also have exclusive licensing. So like Nintendo forbade game creators from writing software for different firms, say for Microsoft or Sony. So if I'm creating an application and I only make it for Nintendo, I can't also make my application or my game for another person. So that way that gives Nintendo that extra edge. Microsoft would bundle products, free applications such as Internet Explorer in the beginning. So if I already have a Microsoft computer and I have a choice between a free Internet Explorer to browse the web, or if I want to get Netscape and have to pay for that Netscape, I'm just going to use Internet Explorer. So that right there makes it almost impossible for competitors in that application market for internet browsers to come in and sell their products, because Microsoft gets their profit by when you actually buy the computer, not within the market for web browsers. And then you can also have government giving single firm exclusive rights to produce something within a specific market. For example, here in this area of Virginia, we have Dominion Electricity Power, and you can only buy electricity from Dominion. If I wanted to start planting power lines everywhere, I'd have to go to the government and say, hey, I want to buy the rights to do this, and most likely they wouldn't sell it to me because they already have given it to Dominion. So to start comparing the outcomes between here, our competitive industry, and then our monopoly, we start off where we have high prices and profits. So mainly we have economic profits within this market. So if when we're in a competitive industry and we have economic profits, that means we'll get new suppliers. So we'll have an increase in the supply curve. Right, you can see that here, where if we have supply and demand, right, here's our equilibrium. Get an equilibrium price, equilibrium quantity. If we get new suppliers coming in, that gives us an increase in supply. So now it also gives us a new equilibrium, where we now have lower prices and increased quantity. But for the monopoly, if they see profits, so if they're say if they had a average total cost curve down here, remember, go to marginal cost equals marginal revenue. At this point here, come down, get the monopoly quantity, come up to the demand curve, then come over for price. All of this box right here, that would be profit, economic profit. But no one else can come in and start making stuff because they have barriers to entry. So this production and supplies are constrained over here for the monopoly. Where when we have this competition, this perfectly competitive market, we actually get an increase in supply. So our prices decrease and we get more quantity. Prices slide down this demand curve here with this increase. We get this new equilibrium. But we do not get a new equilibrium for the monopoly. We're just stuck here with high prices and lower output. So all the more reason why consumers are worse off when you're comparing competitive industries with monopolies. We can also have near monopolies. So this occurs if we have a duopoly, which means there's two firms, but they can also lay back instead of compete with one another, act as one firm, and then just share monopoly-like profits. So essentially, they work together to become a monopoly. If we have several firms controlling the market, they can also realize whether to compete or recognize their mutual interest, and thus avoid competition, and then come and work together in a monopoly. And then we get monopolistic competition, where we have many firms, but they still have distinct brand imaging. So they can still set apart some of the barriers of entry based on whatever brands they already have in place and brand loyalty they get from their customers. So for the monopoly, what gets produced is now decided by marginal cost pricing because they control the entire supply. It's not decided strictly by consumers' demand and dollar votes like it is in the competitive market. So our consumers end up getting fewer goods than they want and at higher prices. In the for whom, we have this reduced supply and higher price, so that means some of the people are going to have to purchase other less desired substitutes. So things that are outside of the market. When we're looking at the how, monopolies tend to inhibit technology because they have no incentive to actually create new things, unless that new technology is just to keep people out, so to keep up any barriers of entry. So for any of the redeeming qualities possibly, monopolies do have a greater ability to pursue research and development. And the lure for that monopoly power, so that amazing profit, does give a very large incentive for invention and innovation up to the point where they become a monopoly. But once they are a monopoly, they no longer have that incentive. So even though the monopolists have a clear financial advantage in pursuing research, unless it's to make the barriers of entry better, they don't have an incentive to do so. And there's also no evidence yet that profit incentives available in the competitive industry are inadequate at all to the monopoly incentives. Monopolies can get in economies of scale. So that would say that the minimum average cost, the bigger they get, the lower their average costs are. So that would mean that monopolies could be more efficient at creating goods. But they can get to a diseconomies of scale where they're actually produced at a higher cost. So there's no way of really knowing where they lay on that economies of scale until the monopoly is actually in place. We do have natural monopolies, such as the telecommunications industry. We have a oligopoly for that. And then usually for your power companies. And your power companies usually have a natural monopoly. So that means you can only get power from one company. Like here in Virginia and this area, we can only get it from Dominion Power. And it's the idea that when they do the entire market supply, they do it more efficiently. You know, if we had 6 rows of power lines going down every street, that would be inefficient. It'd be using up other resources such as a sidewalk or just houses or roads. And so a lot of times we'll have federal, state, and local governments regulating natural monopolies. So they regulate the power industries or the power companies and to tell them what prices they're allowed to charge. Lastly, for the contestable markets, when we have imperfect competitive industries, so we have monopolistic competition, oligopolies, duopolies, monopolies, they are subject to potential entry if the barriers go away, but unless these entry barriers go away, we will not have a contestable market. And this is what leads us to the structure versus the behavior. When we have entry barriers, it's more so the market behavior because it changes the incentives. So because there are no existing rivals, so there's an absence of them, it will inhibit product and productivity improvements. Right? I have no competition. I have no reason to improve my product because people will just continue to buy it because there is no substitute. And that is the end of section 7.